I'll tell you how we hear normally and how you hear when you have a cochlear implant. And so the story begins a long, long time ago when I was a beginning postdoc. And so in October 1989, I had perfect hearing. But by the end of that year, I had no hearing whatsoever. It began when I could not hear the quiet passages of music on a car radio. And that day, turning up the volume helped. But soon, there was no more music. And at the same time, the voices of my friends and my family receded. And I entered a world of silence. Can you hear me, by the way, before I continue?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason for my deafness was a medically necessary dose of ototoxic antibiotics that destroyed the hair cells in my cochlea. And the reason for the antibiotics was that earlier that year, I had contracted acute myelogenous leukemia, which is a truly terrible form of cancer. But thanks to friends and colleagues at the universities that then employed me, especially Cornell University, I received first-rate medical care at the New York Hospital in New York City, which is part of the Cornell University Medical College. An industrial strength dose of chemotherapy beat the cancer, but it left me without an immune system, and the antibiotics protected me until my own immune system had returned. Now, for those who once could hear, deafness is a truly terrible disability, akin to solitary confinement. And you can read of many cases of people who are thus afflicted, who without an adequate support network withdraw from society. They sometimes experience depression, and in some cases turn to substance abuse and even to suicide. For those citizens who experience gradual hearing loss as they age, studies show that they leave the workforce years earlier than they otherwise would do, and generally from then on lead less fulfilling and productive lives. Prelingually deaf children fare worse. They're sent to regular schools with children who can hear, but they're hindered in their ability to develop an oral language. Upon graduation at the age of 18, they have a reading age of a 12-year-old, and that is a gap that is too large to close. Fortunately, science and technology are coming to the rescue to treat many forms of deafness, and in this talk, I'm going to discuss one of those technologies, which is called the cochlear implant, and it has the power, in some cases, to restore hearing to profoundly deaf people. So the outline of the talk will begin by looking at how we hear naturally, and then why some people don't hear well. And then we'll look at ways in which we can solve the hearing loss, focusing on the cochlear implant. I'll briefly say a few words about the political and social issues that surround this technology before moving to the future of the prosthesis. And so we begin with sound itself. Pythagoras, as you know, was the first to reason that sound is a vibration of the air. And sound, as you all know, if you're a physicist, is a form of mechanical energy. When you strike a tuning fork, the oscillatory motion of those times set nearby air molecules into oscillatory motion, and they in turn set more distant air molecules into oscillatory motion. And in this way, the sound wave passes through the air as a mechanical disturbance or pressure wave until it arrives at our pinna or ear flap. And the sequence of events that then follows is truly remarkable. And I would like to show you some of them by using an animation that was made by Brandon Pletch, who is a young medical illustrationist from Georgia in the United States. And it's called Auditory Transduction. And it was awarded the first place a long time ago now, in 2003, in an NSF AAAS Science and Visualization Engineering Challenge. And what I will show you now has been very heavily edited by one of my undergraduate students, Stephen Lichty, and myself. And so you start with the sound being collected by the pinna, and then it's funneled down onto the ear canal, and then it arrives at the tympanic membrane or eardrum, which is about 1 centimeter in diameter. And the tympanic membrane vibrates in response to sound. And the tympanic membrane is conical in shape, and it is articulated. I'm having trouble to start the movie. It is articulated by 3 small bones collectively called the ossicles, but the movie doesn't wish to play. Let's try moving back the slide and getting back again. I think this is something to do with the screen sharing. Yeah, this thing is not playing, it's stopped. I'm not sure what has caused that. What you're supposed to see at this point is a beautiful, this is actually the tympanic membrane. And what you would actually see if the movie was playing is that it would rotate in front of your eyes, and you would see that attached to the tympanic membrane are 3 small bones, and they're collectively called the ossicles, and they are the malleus or hammer, which at this point in the talk would now turn bright green. And then, if the movie was playing, and then there is a second bone called the incus or anvil, of similar size, and then there's a third bone called the stapes or footplate. And these 3 bones are the 3 smallest bones in the human body, with the stapes about the size of a grain of rice. I wonder why that's not playing. It's such a shame. Let's hope that this doesn't continue, else we'll have to switch to a different mode of sharing. And then it is through the ossicles that the vibrations of the tympanic membrane are transmitted to the stapes. And so that's the stapes there, and you saw the ossicles that you would have seen in the last movie as well. So now the stapes moves with a piston-like action at the oval window of the bony labyrinth. And the bony labyrinth is filled with a solution that's similar to cerebral spinal fluid, and that's shown here in purple in the animation. And so as the fluid is relatively incompressible, the piston-like action is in general not possible unless there is a way to preserve the volume of the fluid. And so the way that's achieved is by having a complementary movement to the stapes of a flexible membrane called the round window. And in this way, the sound energy can enter the bony labyrinth. So now the bony labyrinth, which is a few centimeters across, contains on the left the organs of balance and the semicircular canals, and in green, the snail-shaped cochlea or organ of hearing. And so vibrations are produced by the stapes, and they're drawn into the spiral system of the cochlea and rise to its apex, and then descend to the round window. And in more detail, the cochlea consists of 3 tubes called scalae, the scala vestibuli, where the vibrations are rising, the scala tympani, where the vibrations are falling. And each of these tubes is about 1 millimeter across. And then there's a third structure, the third tube called the cochlear duct, sometimes also called the scala media, and it's located between the other 2. And it's filled with a solution that has a high potassium content, just like intracellular fluid, i.e. the fluid in cells. And so it's this difference in chemical composition that gives rise to the power of the cochlea, as we'll see in a moment. And so the cochlea is really small. It's about the size of a chickpea. And it's light, it's very light. And that's so that it's sensitive to very low levels of vibration that would correspond to very soft sounds. And it forms very early. I don't know if you can see my pointer moving, but on the right there is the human cochlea in a child at 6 months gestation. And so at birth, the cochlea is fully formed and it's fully functional. Now, if we increase the magnification further, what we see is that the scala are separated one from another by 2 flexible membranes. That's Reisner's membrane in green, and then the basilar membrane in green. And so these membranes move in response to the vibrations that are traveling through the scala vestibuli. And as they move in response to those vibrations, they flex. And this flexing on the basilar membrane, where the organ of Cochlea resides, a specialized organ, produces a stimulation, and the result is electricity. And that electricity is sent to the brain along the auditory nerve. And the auditory nerve, shown at the right in this drawing, fills the hollow modiolus of the cochlea, and it innervates it upon its entire 35 millimeter helical length. So now let's continue to increase the magnification. The origin of these electrical signals are specialized cells called hair cells within the organ of Cochlea. The inner hair cells, and then 3 rows of outer hair cells. And they're supported on the basilar membrane at the bottom and closely covered at the top in green by a gelatinous membrane called the tectorial membrane. And as the basilar membrane vibrates in response to sound, there are tiny clusters of hairs atop those hair cells from which they derive their name. And those hair cells are bent against the tectorial membrane, and that causes a triggering of the hair cells. And the hair cells fire, and the hair cells are producing at that point electricity. And so the hair cells are mechanoelectrical transducers, and there are 3,500 inner hair cells and about 12,500 outer hair cells in each of your healthy cochlea. So now this basilar membrane does not respond or vibrate simultaneously to sound. Instead, specific areas along the basilar membrane vibrate in response to specific frequencies. And so lower frequencies vibrate the basilar membrane closer to the apex, as shown here, whereas higher frequencies produce vibrations closer to the base. And so the basilar membrane is a frequency analyzer. It's how we perceive pitch. And the relationship between pitch and place in the basilar membrane is called tonotopic organization, which is something that's very important, it turns out, for cochlear implants. And so on the right now is a tonotopic map of the cochlea. And at the base, where the membrane is narrower, thicker, and stiffer, it vibrates at high frequencies, about 20,000 hertz. Whereas at the apex, where the basilar membrane is wider, it's thinner, and it's less stiff, it vibrates at lower frequencies, around 100 hertz. And reminder for reference, 256 hertz is middle C. So now, I hope it won't surprise you to know that physicists have played a very big role in understanding how we hear. Helmholtz, shown on the left, was the first to develop a theory of that the basilar membrane was a frequency analyzer. And George von Beckerje received a 1961 Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology for the observation of tonotopic organization. George von Beckerje was a biophysicist, one of the very first. And so what he did was he experimentally measured the basilar membrane displacements in human cadavers using very loud sounds to render the displacements visible with the technology available in those days. And on the right, you see a plot. And that plot starts with plotting the base of the basilar membrane on the left and the apex on the right. And each of these different graphs corresponds to a different frequency of input signal. And the vertical axis is the displacement of the basilar membrane. And so when the frequency is very low, as in the top graph, you see the maximum displacement is near the apex. And as the frequency increases, it moves towards the base. And so this was the evidence for tonotopic organization. There was remarkable measurements that were performed at the time, but please remember, very loud sounds had to be used to render these displacements visible. So now, von Beckerje's findings in humans stimulated the production of numerous mechanical cochlear models that were able to reproduce the observed wave shapes that he had observed back in the 1930s, 30 years before he won the Nobel Prize. And what you can see, so here's an example. And so the base is on the left. The apex, which would be 36 millimeters away, would be on the far right. But in this graph, we're only showing the first 16 millimeters. And so because it's the base that we're showing, that's where the high frequency sounds produce displacement, the basilar membrane. And so you're seeing here a model that emulates the data that von Beckerjee had taken. And this is how the basilar membrane should be displaced when a 10 kilohertz tone at a low sound level is presented to the cochlea. And you can see that quite a lot, more than a quarter of the entire basilar membrane is actually implicated by this tone. It's resonating due to this tone. And so what this means is that, and let me show you a second example here. So let me see if I can make this work. I'm having some trouble to get it to advance. Let's see if we can get it to advance. Yeah, here we go. So this is another tone. This one is at 20 kilohertz, so it's double the frequency. And you can see the displacement has moved towards the base as expected. But you can also see that much of the same 8 millimeters are displaced in some way. And so what this means is that the human should have very poor frequency selectivity, or if you prefer, poor pitch perception. But this is in stark contrast to reality. Psychophysical data shows us that humans have excellent physical frequency selectivity. For example, C, middle C on the piano is 256 hertz, and C sharp has a frequency 5% higher than C. The human ear can tell, however, a difference in frequency of 0.5%. That is 10 times smaller than the difference between C and C sharp, which corresponds to about 1 hertz at 256 hertz, which is a remarkable frequency selectivity. And so that can't be explained by the von Beckerjee model. And there's another issue as well, which the von Beckerjee model can't explain, and that is, how do we hear soft sounds at all? You saw the very large displacements that von Beckerjee had on that last slide, but the displacements that are being predicted here for soft sounds are tiny. They're a few nanometers, much smaller than von Beckerjee would have measured. So how can we actually hear this at all? And so this is especially true when you consider that the basilar membrane itself is sitting inside a fluid. Now, you know very well that if you walk across dry land, it takes much less effort than wading through the water in a swimming pool, because the water resists your motion. And this should happen also with the basilar membrane in the same way. While louder sounds have the energy to vibrate the membrane enough that it's significantly displaced through the fluid, soft sounds that would correspond to low energy levels are not going to be able to overcome the resistance of the fluid. And so it should be impossible to hear soft sounds, but we do hear soft sounds all the time. So therefore, there must be something more than what Beckerjee knew about. There must be an internal amplifier somewhere in the system that's making this possible. And it was another physicist, in fact, a guy called Tommy Gold, who was a maverick astrophysicist in 1945. And he was thinking about the problem of how we can hear soft sounds. And he suggested there must be an internal amplifier in the ear that we don't yet know about, and that's driving the displacements that enable us to hear. Now, at the time, his ideas were ignored. You could say they fell on deaf ears. And the reason for this was twofold. First, Tommy Gold was not a physiologist. He was an astrophysicist. And would you trust an astrophysicist to tell you how you hear? But secondly, there was a more profound reason. And that was because two problems were trying to be solved: frequency selectivity and how we hear soft sounds. And it wasn't obvious to most people how his idea helped us hear soft sounds. And so while most people can understand that amplification can lead to larger displacement and hence solving the issue of the soft sound, how does it also address the frequency selectivity? Can we solve two problems at once? And so the answer is that we can. And this is what Tommy God realized, in fact. If you now, so consider an example. So this is a familiar example that you've all had when you were children yourself. A child sitting on a playground swing. So as you know, the swing has a natural frequency that's determined by the length of the ropes. So first consider what happens when the child is sitting passively on the swing. And now the parent behind the child pushes the swing, and that's very easy to do at the natural frequency. But the parent can also make the swing move at different frequencies if they wish, by exerting considerably more effort. And in fact, a number of different frequencies are possible. And so we say that this kind of system, a child passive on a swing with an external agent activating it, is a poorly tuned system. But now remove the mother from the picture and remember your own early experiences as a child on a swing, all alone in the playground. And you know that you can kick and make the swing go as high and higher and higher and higher, as long as you kick your legs in time with the swing. But if you happen to kick at a frequency out of time with the swing, then the swing abruptly halts. And so we've changed the system. This is now an active system. The child on the swing is effectively a more narrowly tuned system than the passive child on the swing. So now you say, what's this got to do then with hearing? Well, in the 1980s, it became possible for the first time to make precise measurements on living cochlea. And this is what they found. So if you look at the von Beckerjay model's prediction for 10 kilohertz, and now look at the modern measurements that have taken around 1986, you see this. Completely different to the prediction. And so what you're now seeing is a very narrow piece of the basilar membrane displaced, and that would correspond to good pitch perception, but you're also seeing a very large displacement that corresponds to the amplifier as well. So you've measured two attributes of the amplifier in one go. And so there does exist an amplifier within the organ of Cochlea that increases the displacement of the basilar membrane and provides excellent frequency selectivity. And this amplifier is completely analogous to the active child in the swing analogy. So now, this is now a very important aspect of hearing, as you're now seeing. And before I show you that, I want to show you another way of looking at the active amplification. So this is a plot of the basilar membrane displacement compared to the sound level. So on the left is soft sounds, on the right is loud sounds, and the displacement corresponding to those in nanometers. And so you can see here the dashed line, that's the expectation from the von Beckerjay model. And when the sound is very loud, 120 decibels, von Beckerjay's model agrees with the modern data. But as you get to softer sounds, not that soft actually, just below 100 decibels, it starts to deviate, and there's a much bigger displacement than the von Beckerjay passive mechanical model would predict. So you now have to ask yourself a question. Was von Beckerjay wrong? Should he have not been given the Nobel Prize in 1961? So that's quite a good question to ask, but now I want to give you the answer. So the measurements are delicate, and they're performed on a guinea pig, literally a guinea pig. Guinea pig is a species that has a particularly open geometry in their cochlea, and it's very easy to measure these displacements. And so when one of these experiments is being performed, and it's a very unpleasant experience for the guinea pig died. And when the guinea pig died, and the data was continued to be taken, the data fell, changed completely, and aligned with the von Beckerjay model. So this is now the same animal post-mortem. All the amplification had vanished, all the fine-tuning had gone. And so von Beckerjay got the results he did because he performed them on a human cadaver. A living cochlea is a very different thing to a dead cochlea. So my view, and I think the view of most in the field, is that von Beckerjay was a pioneer and he definitely deserved to win the Nobel Prize. So then, where is the amplifier? Where is this amplification coming from? And so these are modern high magnification images of the basilar membrane. And the inner hair cells you can see on the left in the top figure, and they're innervated. They're very innervated indeed, and those signals are going to the brain. And then there are outer hair cells, 3 rows of them, with these unusual patterns of hairs atop them. And there are around 12,500 of those, and they're sparsely innervated. So there are some signals going to the brain, but not very many at all. And on the right, here's a typical hair cell. This is what they actually look like. This one is 30 microns long, and it's 5 microns in diameter, and it happens to be an inner hair cell. The outer hair cells are a bit longer. And so let's look at what these hair cells are actually doing. And so what we have here in the bottom right are the cilia of the hair cell, and they're about 500 nanometers across on average. That's about a 50th the diameter of a human hair on your head. And they're joined by tip links, which are fibrous actin strands, only a few nanometers wide, about 20 times wider than an atom. And as the hairs are bent, as shown in the cartoon at the top, due to the presence of sound, the tip links pull open trapdoors in the hairs themselves, and the potassium-rich solution of the cochlear duct can flow through those trapdoors into the cell. And our cells, and this is the lower right-hand picture, are like batteries. They're highly polarized, and the influx of the potassium rapidly depolarizes them, and then through a sequence of very complex chemical steps, there's a release of neurotransmitters at the base of each of these cells, and then these send signals to the brain. And that's how inner hair cells and outer hair cells work, both of them, both types. But the inner hair cells are sending signals to the brain, and they're deeply afferent. So there's lots of signals going to the brain. Very little is coming from the outer hair cells. So what is the purpose then of the outer hair cells? And so this is actually a photograph of an outer hair cell. And this one is 70 microns long. It's a typical outer hair cell. And what we're going to do now is play music. And I hope this actually works. We're going to play some music through this electrode into the outer hair cell. And so what's actually happening is we have the speakers producing the music. The music we're then turning into a current. The current's coming out and going to go into the outer hair cell, and that current is modulated by the amplitude and by the tempo of the music. And so watch what happens to the outer hair cell as we play this piece of music, which I hope won't be too loud, and I hope will actually work. Let's try this. Wasn't that great? So you see the outer hair cell is actually dancing to the music. So the first thing you have to think about is, why did that happen? Because when the current flows into the outer hair cell, it causes a contraction of the outer hair cell by 1 to 2 microns. And when the cell repolarizes because the trapdoor closes, that hair cell is returning to its ordinary length. That's one thing. The other thing you've got to remember is the next time you dance to music, it's not just you that's dancing, it's around 16,000 hair cells in each of your healthy cochlea. So now, the sequence of events then, in the top cartoon, the basilar membrane is displaced, the tectorial membrane bends the tips of the hair cells. Those hair cells are now then receiving the current shown by the positive signs for the potassium in that bottom top left cartoon. And they contract just like in the movie. And when they contract, because they're attached to the basilar membrane, they cause the basilar membrane to displace more than it would normally in the von Beckerjay model. And that displacement means that even the softest sounds are producing a displacement, which then causes inner hair cells, cilia, shown in the bottom left, to deflect. And in the same way, the potassium current runs into those, and the neurotransmitters are released at the base of the cell, and the current then flows to the brain. And that's the sequence, the whole sequence of the human physiology. And so outer hair cells are mechanical amplifiers, and they contract during transduction, enhancing basilar membrane displacements, increasing sensitivity to soft sounds, and they also improve pitch perception as well, as we've seen with the analogy of the child in the swing. And so to recap, from the motion of air molecules to the vibration of the eardrum, to the transmission of these vibrations by the ossicles, by the piston-like action of the stapes, the displacement of the fluids in the scalae, the vibrations of the basilar membrane, the deflection to cilia, atop the hair cells, the production of potentials that pass along the auditory nerve to the brain. It is this sequence of events that is responsible for our auditory perception of the world around us. Okay, so that's how we hear. That's all there is to it. It's truly remarkable. So now, that's how we hear, but sometimes we don't hear. And there's 5 main reasons why we don't hear. The first is genetic. The second is infection, such as bacterial meningitis or rubella. The third is exposure to loud sounds that can produce so much vibration, so much displacement that they snap the hair cells, physically break them. The fourth is prescription drugs, such as, in particular, antibiotics, some of which are ototoxic, but also some chemotherapeutic agents as well. And that's what happened to me in 1989. And then there's hearing loss due to old age, and about 10% of all of our citizens currently alive in the world experience that. So that's a lot of people that are deaf. So the main types of hearing loss then are conductive. That's when the ossicles no longer function. Now, the ossicles are a series of bones that are joined like levers. And because they're a mechanical system, it's possible to operate and make a mechanical repair. And so you can restore conductive hearing loss. However, the most common form of hearing loss is sensory neural, which is sometimes called nerve deafness, but it's not nerve deafness at all. It's actually the loss of hair cells. So in the vast majority of cases, what happens is people experience a loss of some hair cells. And this results in a mild or moderate hearing loss. So in such cases, now for a given amount of sound energy, there's less electricity naturally getting to the brain. And so we can make up for that by amplifying the sound before it gets to our cochlea. And if we do that in the ear canal, for example, then the extra sound will be transmitted to the stapes, and that will move more forcefully than before, and a stronger vibration will be presented to the cochlea. And in this way, hearing aids help. Now, in about 4% of cases, the number of hair cells lost is extremely large. And in those cases, hearing aids do not help at all. For example, I can wear a hearing aid, but I would hear absolutely nothing. And that's because no matter how loud the amplified sound, there's an absence of a transaction mechanism. There's no hair cells. And so no electrical signals are produced and sent to the brain. And it is for this type of deafness that the cochlear implant can sometimes be a solution. So you may be surprised to know that the first cochlear implant was developed more than 200 years ago by the great scientist Volta, who also invented the battery, and that's no coincidence. And so, let me tell you what Volta did. Volta placed 2 metallic probes in both ears and connected the ends of the 2 probes to a 50-volt battery and observed that. At the moment when the circuit was completed, I received a shock in the head. And some moments after, I began to hear a sound, or rather a noise in the ears, which I cannot well define. It was a kind of a crackling with shocks, as if some paste or tenacious matter had been boiling. They wrote beautifully in those days, don't you think? He went on to say, the disagreeable sensation, which I believe might be dangerous because of the shock in the brain, prevented me from repeating the experiment. And this is a true story, and that's the reference. You can check it out in the Bodleian or online. So now let's move forward about 200 years to the modern cochlear implant. So the thing you must keep in mind is that unlike a hearing aid, which makes sounds louder, a cochlear implant does not make sounds louder at all. A cochlear implant bypasses the non-functional hair cells of the ear and delivers weak electrical signals directly to the auditory nerve. So let's talk you through the different bits or parts of a cochlear implant. So I'm actually wearing a cochlear implant at the moment, which you might be able to see, and I'm going to take it off now. So I'm going to plunge myself into complete deafness. But this is the cochlear implant. I'm hoping that you can see that. And so sounds are picked up by a microphone and turned into an electrical signal. So the microphone is at the front here of my cochlear implant. And then the signal is analyzed by passing through a speech processor, which is an ASIC, which has a series of bandpass filters in it. And in that way, the spectrum is analyzed and then coded, by which I mean turned into a special pattern of digital signals in the form of electrical pulses, ones and zeros. The next thing that happens is that these pulses are then sent from here to here. And this can be wireless, but in this particular case, I'm wearing a wire because it's sometimes more convenient. And so this is the coil antenna. So this is a transmitter. And what this transmitter is going to do is send the modulated radio wave with the digital information on it across the intact skin of my skull to a receiver in the implant, which is inside my head. So the implant inside my head, and I can't show you that part, reads the program data and follows the instructions that it receives. And that pattern, it then turns back into analog electrical pulses and passes them on multiple electrodes to the cochlea. Now, in this particular diagram, there's only one red line shown. So that's only one electrode, but in practice, there are many. And the next thing that happens is the auditory nerve, which is shown here in yellow, picks up the electrical pulses and sends them to the brain. And then the brain recognizes the signals as sound. And I should stress, in this picture, the brain is not to scale. And so here's a highly schematic diagram of the microphone, the speech processor, the transmitter, then the intact skin, and then the receiver and the electrode array. And in natural hearing, remember, the high frequency sounds stimulate the cochlea and auditory nerve at the base, and the low frequency sounds at the apex. So the key idea with the cochlear implant is to exploit the natural tonotopic arrangement of the cochlea and auditory nerve by using typically 10 to 22 electrodes, each placed at a separate location of the cochlea. And then the speech processor continuously measures and sorts the sounds by pitch and by loudness. And the high frequency sounds are sent to electrodes in the form of electrical currents at the cochlear base, and the low frequencies are sent to electrodes at the cochlear apex. And here is a multi-channel electrode in the scalar tympani. And in light green, that is the auditory nerve. And the gray rectangles here represent electrodes, and white represents a pulse of electricity on the electrode. And in my device, the one I'm wearing now, about 18,800 pulses are being sent to my auditory nerve every second. So cochlear implants have improved dramatically in the last 20 years of the 20th century. Between about 1980 And around the year 2000, or just slightly later, there was dramatic improvement. And since then, there's not been much improvement. And so what this graph is showing is, in the vertical axis, is a sentence recognition when speech is relayed to an implantee. And on the bottom axis is time and type of device. So it's starting from a single electrode device in 1980 made by the 3M Corporation, which was very similar to Volta's single electrode in his ear. It enables sound to be perceived, but not comprehended. And then all of the other examples here are multi-electrode devices, typically 10 to 24 electrodes, and a variety of different manufacturers are shown: Nucleus, Inarray, Clarion, Midel, and so on, with a variety of speech coding strategies like multi-speak, speak, CIS, etc., which are all just ways of organizing information presented to the auditory nerve. And as the devices have evolved, so have the abilities of subjects to recognize sentences. So by the year 2000 or so, a good user of a cochlear implant could understand about 90% of the sentences that they heard. Now, I was aware that the devices had been getting better and better, but I didn't have a cochlear implant myself. But then in 2001, I was at Caltech for a conference, and there I had a conversation with a close friend of mine, Andreas Kronfeld, who is a very well-known particle theorist of Fermilab. And he told me that his brother-in-law had a cochlear implant and that it had changed his life. And so I decided to learn more. So at the time I was living in America, and so this slide is about America, but it's not so very different in other countries. So who can actually have a cochlear implant? So the requirements are, for the US, are the following. For adults, and I'll talk about children separately, adult here means 18 or older, but there's no limitation by age. There are people who are 90 years of age who have a cochlear implant and have benefited from it. You must have bilateral, moderate to profound sensory neurohearing loss, i.e. almost no hair cells. And you must demonstrate that you don't benefit from a state-of-the-art digital hearing aid in a 6-month trial. The last time that data was available with this level of granularity in the United States was in 2012, but I'll talk more about up-to-date data later. About 1 million citizens qualify in the US, and at that time, 96,000 of them actually had a cochlear implant, with about 2/3 being adults and just over 1/3 being children. Now, you need to be psychologically suitable. And at the time I was evaluated for a cochlear implant, I was lip reading because I couldn't hear. That's the way I communicated, was lip reading. And the medical staff told me, no psychotics. And I thought they said, no physicists. And another important thing is there should be no anatomical medical contraindication, like a bony occlusion that would block the electrode passing into your cochlea. So then if the requirements are met, there's an extensive audiological and medical testing, CT scans, MRIs, and so on. And then you get to choose a device. There's 3 major manufacturers of these devices: Cochlea in Australia, Midel in Austria, and Clarion in the United States. All devices have very similar performance, and the patient is the largest variable in the outcome. And then you have to wait for surgery, and that can be many, many months. And then finally the surgery day arrives, and here is the cochleostomy, an opening in the round window, and there is the electrode being inserted into the scala tympani. And there's also a postage stamp-sized recess that's going to be carved into your mastoid bone with a drill to hold the receiver stimulator and the magnet. So post-operatively, no one has ever died, as far as records show, from a cochlear implant operation. But the most common complications are wound infection or breakdown, and this usually resolves itself. Facial nerve injury. The cochleostomy that you just saw is performed just several millimeters from the facial nerve. And if the nerve is transected, it does not regrow. It means permanent facial paralysis. And that is a tragedy for the patient, and it's a tragedy for the surgeon as well. And it is exceptionally rare, fortunately. There is the possibility of vertigo because the bony labyrinth also has the organ of balance. That usually resolves itself with healing. And then you have to avoid MRI because you have a magnet inside your head. And the magnet, the purpose of the magnet is to ensure that the external transmitter is in close proximity to the receiver stimulator to ensure effective signal transmission. And then you have to wait 8 weeks after you've had this surgery for the wound to heal before the device can actually be turned on for the first time. And hopefully the patient will hear sound. And if you're in the US when this is happening, the next thing that happens to you is that you wonder how to pay the medical bill. So this is how much it costs in the US. So it's about $60,000 to $100,000, including the evaluation of the surgery, the post-operative care, the hospital care, and the audiological rehabilitation. Medicare and Medicaid pay total or partial costs, on private insurers refuse to cover the devices, but fortunately today, most do provide excellent coverage. The reimbursement levels, this is a quote, have forced hospitals to close cochlear implant programs due to the cost of subsidizing the implants. Other hospitals ration services by putting patients on waiting lists. And as of the statistics I showed you before, there's around 45,000 children that were eligible back in 2012 in the US, and 38,000 had one. So there was priority given to implanting young children, but only 6% of adults that were eligible had them. Now, in Western Europe, where we have socialized medicine, the uptake is about a factor 2 higher. And so cost is still an issue. And yet the cost of a cochlear implant is very small compared to the cost in government aid for education and training, estimated at about $1 million over the course of a lifetime. And that's not to mention the massive human cost going through life in a hearing world without being able to hear yourself. So another quote, ultimately, this is about the way society views hearing. Being deaf is not going to kill you. And so ensuring that a cochlear implant is available to anyone who could benefit from it is not the highest priority. And that's true in every country. So I was one of the lucky ones. The cost of my implant was covered by insurance because by the time I got the implant, I was now a professor. And so finally, you remember you had the surgery and you have to wait 8 weeks or so. And then finally the activation date is given to you and you can turn up and you can get your hearing back, you hope. And so what happened in my case was that we were planning to go home to Europe. My wife's Italian, I'm English. We're going to go home and see our families for Christmas and New Year. But my surgery was in November and the activation date was set for mid-January. So we were rather disappointed because this would mean I would go back to Europe, but I'd have a swollen head from the surgery, literally a swollen head, and I wouldn't be able to hear anything. But then very, very fortunately, 4 days before our flight to London, the hospital called to say that there'd been a cancellation and could Ian drive down the following day. So I did. It's a 60-mile drive on a highway. It's a drive I do all the time. I was very used to it, but on this day, it seemed to take a lot longer than before. Because what's going through your mind is whether at the end of this drive, you're going to get your hearing back after 12 years. And so I'm driving on the road, I arrive, I get to the very high-tech audiologist's office in a fabulous children's hospital, which is where the surgery had been as well. And the device is then extensively tested. You're wearing it, of course, it's inside you. And settings are downloaded into memory. And you're hooked up to a PC for all of this, but you're not hearing anything at this time because the device hasn't actually yet been turned on. And I say PC advisedly because this is not Mac compatible. This device actually would crash a Mac, but it runs very well with a PC. So you've heard no sound, and this goes on for about an hour, this procedure. And so at that point, I remember I'm lip reading, and the audiologist turns to me and she says, please understand that we're now ready to turn the device on, and it'll be in another couple of minutes, but you've been deaf for 12 years, so there's a very high chance that you will not hear anything when this device is turned on. If you're very lucky, you'll hear soft sounds, and if you're really lucky, you might actually understand what I'm saying, but don't get your hopes up. And so, of course, this is rather concerning. And so she went back to her monitor, and several more minutes passed, and they seemed like an absolute age. And so I became really impatient. I just said, have you turned on this device yet? And before I got to the end of that sentence, I realized I'd heard my own voice for the first time in 12 years. better yet, that evening, I heard my wife's voice for the first time in 12 years. And because my daughter was born after I became deaf, I got to hear my daughter's voice for the very first time. And there are no words at all in the English language to describe how wonderful all of this was, but that is the power of the cochlear implant, the power of science and engineering to improve the human condition. And so how well does this implant work? So here's an audiogram that many of you may have had if you've had your hearing tested. The vertical scale is soft sounds at the top and loud sounds at the bottom. And the horizontal scale runs from low frequencies to high frequencies. And the green here represents normal hearing in a typical young, healthy adult at age about 18. Hearing starts to degrade already when we're in our 20s, in fact. And so that's normal hearing. And what you can see in pink, those circles there, was my hearing before the implant had been installed and turned on. And so that means, that kind of hearing means that if you were on the runway, you would just about be able to hear as well as feel a jumbo jet taking off. And then the open circles, drawn with a pen, my hearing 6 months after activation. And so that's the kind of typical hearing that somebody in their 40s might have naturally. And so I'd be characterized as mildly hard of hearing at that point. Now, what about the test of how do you understand with that though? How does speech work? So these on the right is speech tests, different types of speech test. And these are my scores in those tests before the operation. And so you see, in some cases, I got 0%. I can tell you it's really embarrassing to be a physics professor and get 0% on a test. And when it said DNT, that meant do not test, because there's no point. If you've got 0% on the easy test, it's really not going to do well on the harder test. But then you see my test scores 6 months after the operation. In some cases, I got more than 90% on the test, which I was pretty pleased with. And they were, the surgeon and the audiologist were really pleased. So at the time, I was regarded as a star performer. My performance was exceptional. But the good news is that 75% of recent post-lingually deaf adults or other post-lingually deaf people, including young adults with state-of-the-art devices, can use a phone without any visual cues. So then the question becomes, why does this device work? You saw that we have 3,500 inner hair cells, and we've replaced them with something like 10 or 20 electrodes. How is it possible that this device can work so well? And so the key thing to understand is that hearing doesn't end at the cochlea. Hearing is perception, and perception, whether it is visual or auditory, is a dynamic combination of top-down and bottom-up processing. So the need that we have for sensory detail depends on the distinctiveness of the object and the level of familiarity we have with it. If you see a large gray animal moving in the distance in a jungle, you don't need to know much detail to know that it's an elephant. So let's look at this in more detail. So I'd like to give you a visual example of how an analog of hearing first, and then we'll do real hearing. So I'm going to show you an image of a famous person. And I'll also tell you that it's a famous American person and it's a historical figure. He's not alive today. Now the image will contain very few pixels, and you should be able to recognize the person, not by the input from the image alone, i.e. not from the bottom-up information that's contained on the slide, but by the top-down processing that I just told you about. This is a person, it's a human being, it's a famous person, it's an American, it's historical, he's not alive today. And so you'll be relying on using that information, the top-down, much more than the bottom-up, because you're familiar with it. So do you know who this is? I unfortunately can't see one of your faces, but Some of you will probably know who this is already. You'll probably recognize, just from this one image, this very poor, grainy image with very little pixelation, that this is actually Lincoln. And I hope that most of you saw that that was Lincoln, but if you didn't, don't worry, because I can double the number of pixels. And that already brought about some more of you recognizing it was Lincoln. And let's double them again, and double them again, and in comes Lincoln. So the language equivalent of that would be a missing word in a familiar phrase. For example, I pledge allegiance to the United States of America. Now you can be pretty sure the missing word was flag. The word flag was never said, but you know from the context that the word was flag. And this is how post-lingually deaf people, whether they're teenagers or whether they're adults, using an implant understand speech. We receive relatively poor information, a poor pixelization of the word image. And some words are completely missing and some don't sound quite right, but due to our knowledge of language and context, we can fill in the gaps. Now that's a very powerful way of understanding, and I'd now like to take away your ability to use top-down processing. I'll show you an image that you've all seen before, but it's an image with which you have much less familiarity. And it is much less distinctive. And when you first see it, with just a few pixels, you'll probably not be able to overcome the paucity of bottom-up information by using the top-down information, because I've given you almost no top-down information. So tell me what this is, and of course you don't know. I've given this talk a few times now, and no one has ever known what that image is. Then one shouldn't be surprised by that. It's just a series of seemingly random colored pixels, and there's not many pixels. So let's double the number of pixels. But it's still hard to recognize it, and let's double them again. And no one has ever guessed what this image was at this level of pixelation. Let's increase the number of pixels. You can see it's gradually turning into something that perhaps you might have seen before. And just once, when I gave this talk, somebody recognized what this image was at this point. Everyone else had to wait for that last one. So this is this integration of the persistence of memory by Salvador Dali, which you've all seen before, but none of you would have recognized when there was only a few pixels on the page and you had to rely only on bottom-up information. So the auditory analog of this is a missing word in an unfamiliar phrase, or a phrase in a language we do not speak, or language heard for the first time through a cochlear implant. And that is exactly the situation a child born deaf is in when using a cochlear implant. So while a post-lingually deaf adult like me has to recognize a poor quality image of Lincoln, a young child has to recognize the low resolution Dali painting, which is so much harder. So this is a photograph, and it's a photograph of the word choice. And what we're plotting here is frequency versus time. And intensity of the sound is color-coded, with white being the loudest. And so you can see the red bar rising on the left is the ch sound. The oi, the implosive sound, is the white area towards the bottom of the picture. And then again, the red area top right is the s at the end of choice, so the three parts of the sound. So what does it, if you take the same picture of the same word with a cochlear implant, what does it look like? So it looks like that. So this happens to be a 22-channel cochlear implant, and the electrode number has now replaced the frequency. But apart from that, it's exactly the same image, and clearly these patterns have similarities, but are they similar enough to recognize the word choice? And so you can ask the question, what are the features of the pattern of neural output from a cochlea that are most critical for recognition of speech? Is it the amplitude, the loudness? So the answer to that is no, because as long as I'm audible, it does not matter to you whether I'm talking slightly louder or slightly softer. How about the temporal structure of the sound? This correlates with the pulse rate of the implant. So with a movie, if the frame rate, an old-fashioned movie, I mean, if the frame rate is too slow, you would be very aware of a sequence of stills instead of a continuous motion. And so you would have you wouldn't have continuous motion, of a staccato motion. And you've probably seen that. The same would be true for a cochlear implant if the pulse rate was very slow. But in my device and in most other devices, it's very high, 18,000 a second. And so that's more than sufficient to give a sense of continuous sound. The third possibly important feature is the number of locations at which the auditory nerve is stimulated and the place at which it's stimulated. And that correlates with frequency. That's tonotopic organization. That turns out to be the most important feature. So now I'm going to try to see if this works this time. I'm going to play for you a sound. And the sound is going to be what I would hear, or anyone else would hear with a cochlear implant, if they only had a single electrode. And so to do this, what we've done is we've taken sounds, a sentence in this case, and the person speaking the sentence has spoken into a single bandpass filter, and that's what one channel corresponds to. So all the sound is going through that bandpass filter. So that means that there's no information about frequency. What there is still temporal information. Now, this may or may not work, and if it doesn't work, then I will change the way in which I share it with you. So I think that didn't work. So let me change the way I share. And this will take a few seconds to do. And I hope that while you're waiting, you've been able to follow what I've been talking about so far, and you've been thinking of questions you want to ask at the end of the talk.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So far, great talk. We're looking forward. We'll talk more about it later. If anyone listening has questions, feel free to put them in the chat so we can pick them up later, but there will also be a chance for you to unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Right. So now I want to try to share again. And let's see if this works. So at the moment, I don't think you can actually see the slide at all, can you?
Not right now.
You can't, right? Okay.
No.
I couldn't hear. It was like yes or no?
No, sorry.
Yeah, I still didn't hear it. So say the number 33 for yes and 50 for no.
50.
Okay, good. So then I will try to fix that problem by making it share another way. Let's see. Yes, okay, so they've got Zoom back, I think now. It's good. And then we go to share screen. I'm going to try to just do a simple share this time. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so what I want to do then, so this is where we were just now. And this time I'm hoping that these are going to work. So you're going to hear a sentence. And I'd like you to tell me if you can understand what it is. It's a sentence in English. But remember, it won't have any frequency information. So let's try and see if it works. Okay, so I think that Tasman was going to run a poll at this point. Tasman, are you going to do that? Yeah, so can you understand what's being said? Okay, if you can understand what's being said, oh, look at that. So far, we're running it at close to 100%. Good, good, good. This is normal. Wonderful. So lots of people are voting and people are understanding what's being said. That's right. I think we can stop the poll at this point. It's clear. You can't understand it. Now, but remember, what we've done here is we've played a single electrode. And we've played a single channel, a single bandpass filter. And that's very much like that paste or tenacious matter that we've been boiling in Volta's ears. And therefore, you basically got no frequency information at all. So now let's go instead to two channels. So what two channels means, what two channels means is that we're going to stimulate essentially the cochlea at two places, the base and the apex. And we're going to put all the frequencies either into the base or the apex. And so all frequencies will go through one of two bandpass filters. And so the sound will sound different to last time, but it should be so difficult to understand. Let's go. So did you understand that or not? Please vote. Okay, so it's pretty similar to last time, and that's of course what we expected, because we haven't given you very much information. What you're being forced to do is rely on bottom-up information, just bottom-up information. And this is very hard if you don't have much tonal information. This is the key. So now what we're going to do next is go to more channels. We're going to try 4 channels and see if you understand this one. Who understood that? Okay, so we're still seeing the same pattern, and that's what always happens in this talk. So now, I'm now going to play for you 8 channels. Now, 8 channels is exactly what I have. I actually have 10 electrodes, but 2 broke during the surgery, so I've got 8. Now, I can understand with 8, but I've had to learn a few tricks to do that. So I'm going to play for you 8, and you might understand it. Some people do, but not everyone will. But let's see, how many of you understand 8? So let me try to play 8 here. So anyone understand it? Okay, this is what usually happens. We usually get, maybe 10% or so that understand it. Now, for those that understood it, I would like one of those people to write in the chat window what the sentence actually was. Could you do that so that we can see if you understood it? And I'm opening my chat window so I can actually see what you're saying. So whoever thought they understood it, it's got to write in the chat window what it was. And don't be shy. It's okay if you're not right. So Tasmin, no one is writing in the chat window.
Come on, people.
Ah, there we go. I'd like to play chess. Fantastic. Okay, no, you're not right. That's not what it said, but you're very close. You're very, very close. And it will be a consolation to you to know that every time anyone has ever guessed it, and at 8 channels, they've always guessed it was either I'd like to play chess or did it end with test. This is what nearly always happens, these types of things. Both of these are very close. One of them is very close on the first 4 words, in fact, accurate. And one of them is really close on the last word, but not quite. So now I want to play for you the original, right? So you've heard 8 channels, and 2 of you out of the 17 that voted kind of got it, very close, but not quite. So now let me play for you the original. And before I do play that original, I want to remind you that, or tell you for the first time, 8 channels in the original sound exactly the same to me. But to you, they will sound very different. So here's the original.
I like to play tennis.
So, very different, right? Now, there's something else that we can do at this point. Until now, you've been forced to rely on top-down, on bottom-up information. You've been forced to rely on that sound coming through to you as I played 1, 2, 4, 8 channels. Now that you've heard the original, you understand what it was, and of course you remember what it was. But when you hear 8 channels this time, you will understand it because you're using the top-down processing. And you may think this is a trivial example, but in fact, in a minute, I'll explain that it's not so trivial. So let me play for you again 8 channels. And I want people to say if they could understand it this time, generally understand it this time.
I like to play tennis.
So that was 8 channels. And did everyone understand it? Yeah, exactly. Everybody's understanding it. Several people didn't understand it still. Okay. So, but most people did. So it's almost the opposite of the previous time. And so this is because of the top-down processing that you're using to enable you to interpret the sounds. Of course, you're also relying on your memory because you remember what the person just said. However, you're being an honest experimental guinea pig and you're telling me whether you understood it or not. And so most people did this time. So that is actually top-down processing, the power of it. Now, I was going to say something else. And that is that I told you I have 8 channels. And the original and 8 channels sound the same to me, but they sound different to you. And you probably all prefer the original. So what's really interesting is that when I first got my cochlear implant, the 8 channels sounded mechanical, robotic, very inhuman, the sound. However, very, very quickly, within the space of a few hours, my brain said, no, people don't sound like robots. They actually sound like human beings. And so although the 8 channel and the original sound the same to me, they actually sound beautiful. They sound like a real human voice. Although if you actually looked at the activity on my auditory nerve, it corresponds to the robotic sounds that you heard. And so cochlear implantees, and most cochlear implantees can do this, they live in a world that's actually rich and very beautiful in sound, but most of it is constructed by the brain and guided by the bottom-up information. So I'm going to now close off that chat window so I can see the slide and also try to close the poll so that I can see that as well. What I would like to do is stop sharing and go back to my previous mode at this point, which will be easier for me to give the talk. So that means that I have to go back to PowerPoint. Then I have to end the show. And then go to, whoops. So back to Zoom, and hopefully I can reshare the slides at this point. Let's see, there it is. This is the first time I've given this talk this way, and I normally don't keep switching between modes of sharing, but it was better for me in this case to do it this way. Right, so I hope you can see that slide again. Can you?
Yeah.
Yeah, say 33, not yes, because yes is hard to understand.
33.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll ask you a question at the end about why 33 is easy to understand and yes is not, but that's a question for the end for the audience. So we just had this slide, so let's move on to the next one. So now this is a graph about how people learn with a cochlear implant. The thing is that the sounds are very coarse at first, so it takes time to adjust to the limited sensory detail that's provided by the cochlear implant. And so you actually have to learn how to use the device, how to understand speech. And so this is a plot of a bunch of people that were tested before they got the implant. That's the pre-op. And then how well did they perceive speech in the months after they had received their cochlear implant? And what you can see is that this is leveling off at about 80% for these particular patients after 6 months. So there's been a dramatic improvement. And what this is actually is a demonstration of the plasticity of the adult brain. But all of the adults in the study were post-lingually deaf. They had, therefore, the advantage of being able to use top-down processing to understand speech, meaning that they had to recognize a poor quality Lincoln, not a poor quality Dali. So what about the pre-lingually deaf children? What about those who are trying to identify that poor quality Dali? What chance do they have? It's very hard. So let's look at this. So before I look at how well children do, I want to make a remark about the deaf community and cochlear implants. So what I'm going to talk about is the US experience, but it's similar in most Western countries, in fact. And so probably many of you know someone that is profoundly deaf. And people can lead very full and very satisfying lives without emphasizing speech when they're part of the deaf community. Here I denote deaf in this sense with uppercase D. These are people that learn to read. That's important for them, but speech is less important in this type of community. The way they communicate is sign language. So in the 1990s, we go way back to when cochlear implants really started. There was very strong opposition to pediatric implantation, while there was a general neutrality towards adult implantation. And the reason is because the implant, if given to a deaf child, is going to delay the deaf child's acquisition of sign language and their assimilation into the deaf community. And so way back in 1991, the actual National Association for the Deaf in the United States stated that they deplore the federal government's decision to approve pediatric implantation because it is unsound scientifically, procedurally, and ethically. But 10 years later, the deaf community began to regard cochlear implantation as a personal choice. And so this is a statement from 2000 where they emphasized taking advantage of technological advances that had the potential to improve the quality of life for deaf and hard of hearing persons. And they strongly support the development of the whole child and of language and of literacy. So here are the results of a large study. One of the largest studies that was done, this study was done around 10 years ago or so. And it shows the language development in profoundly deaf children with cochlear implants. And so the left plot is a plot of language on the vertical axis and age on the horizontal axis. And so the y equals x line is for hearing children. So when your language age, when your physical age is 48 months, your language age is 48 months. And what these points are children, real children, who are prelingually deaf. And they have a language age, therefore, that's much less than their physical age. Now, the black circles here are those that are going to be implanted, and the white circles are those that will not be implanted, and so they form the control group. And then the right plot shows the average performance before and post-implant for the children that are implanted compared to the predicted performance if they'd not been implanted. And so you can see that the children that are implanted after the implant start to acquire language at a similar rate to the hearing children and can eventually catch up. So to quote the paper, despite a large amount of individual variability, the best performers in the implanted group seem to be developing an oral linguistic system based largely on auditory input from a cochlear implant. And that is a truly remarkable result. And for me, is the most joyful thing about this talk is that result. And that result has been repeated since widely. This one was done at the Raleigh Hospital for Children in Indianapolis, which is where I was implanted myself. It's crucial to stress something though. The cochlear implant will not give prelingually deaf children the ability to learn language or prelingually deaf adults the ability to learn language through the implant unless you provide a supportive environment as well. And that means that you're still using other cues, visual cues, signing, things like that, if the child knows that, because it takes a lot of work for a child to recognize that grainy, poor image of darling. So, due in part to the small number of electrodes, the cochlear implant has poor pitch perception compared to natural hearing. And so in most cases, this does not hinder speech comprehension, but music appreciation relies on the ability to recognize pitch. And so this means that music, melody recognition is extremely difficult, although lyrics help. So I don't know if this is going to work. Let's hope it works. Now, what you're going to hear is music. It's actually a famous piece of music, and it's played through a cochlear implant. So this is what it sounds like for me. Wasn't that nice? To me, that was great. That was great music. But it looks like for you, it was sounded less like music than music. And that's because there wasn't much tonal information, although there was excellent temporal information. So now I want to play for you the original as you would hear it. And before I play the original, I want to tell you that for me, the original and what you just heard sound exactly the same. For you, they should sound very different. And I think you'll find the second one much more pleasant than the first. Wasn't that beautiful, right? So, but it sounded so different. So who liked the second one more than the first? Can you want to rerun the poll so that we can just see that? Tasman, is that possible? Yeah, so now, did it sound like music this time? Yes, fantastic, right? Okay, so now, there's something else to say about this though. And that yes, this is a big limitation of the cochlear implant. And there are tricks. So if you know the music before it's played, which means that you heard it before you were deaf, then you can use musical memory as a form of top-down processing to make the music beautiful. And so this means that when I know what a piece of music is before, and when I hear it, it sounds just like it did when I was a hearing person. But if I hear music that I've never heard before, then it's very difficult to discern. And certainly not very pleasant. So that's another example of top-down processing, the brain making the sounds right, guided by a minimal amount of bottom-up information. And so that's just repeated there at the bottom of the slide. So I can enjoy music very much when my musical tastes are totally frozen at the time I became deaf. So how can a cochlear implant be improved? One possibility is to combine electrical and acoustic stimulation. And so this targets patients with reasonable low frequency hearing. And it turns out that as we get older, what happens is that we lose that low frequency hearing, but it can be restored with a hearing aid. But if the person has little high frequency hearing that's commonly lost with age, then a short cochlear implant electrodes just stimulating the base of the cochlear vascular membrane can give you back the high frequencies. And so the graph shown here is how accurate the person's perception of the sentences were. And when the person was wearing only the hearing aid, they understood nothing. When they had the cochlear implant on, they got it right half the time. But when they had both, they understood everything that they heard, almost 84%. I should say that a hearing person in this type of test would get 100%. Now, the next thing you can think about is whether you should have two cochlear implants rather than one. Is it better to have one than two? So to answer that question, you need to think about how we tell the direction of a sound. If a sound is coming from the left, then it arrives at the left ear slightly before the right ear. And then it passes from both cochlea through variable length delay lines for each ear, running to a common neuron in the medial superior olive, which is that pink blob in the center. So that neuron fires when the pulses from both ears arrive in coincidence. And so in the example, you can actually see that the neuron that's fired here was neuron E. So now if we move the sound source slightly, we've changed the interaural time arrival at each ear, left and right. And so when the signals arrive, there'll be a different neuron that fires, perhaps D. And in this way, humans have developed the ability to detect the direction of the sound with about 1 degree accuracy. But if you only have a single cochlear implant, then you have no sense of direction because output is only coming from one ear. And so the neurons never receive sounds in synchrony, and so they never fire. And so you can't tell direction. And so the chart on the right, top right here, shows 7 cochlear implantees who were lucky enough to have 2 implants. And when one was turned off, and they were asked, is the sound on the right or on the left? They got it right 50% of the time. In other words, it was a complete guess. However, when both of their cochlear implants were turned on, they scored almost 100%. And that is similar to a hearing person would score in that same test. The difference is that the cochlear implants' degree of precision at measuring the direction is only about 16 degrees. It's not 1 degree. There's a second reason why you might want to have 2 cochlear implants, and that is because we live in a very noisy world. And so in this setup, speech is coming from the front and is played, noise is also played into the system. And that noise is played in the first example in blue on the left. And a person is asked to understand the speech, and they don't do very well because the noise is going into the same place as the speech in the cochlear implant. But now, if we have speech from the front and the noise is from the right, your head shadow will block the noise getting to the cochlear implant, and then you'll perform very well, but not perfectly. But then if you go one step further and actually have bilateral hearing aids, cochlear implants, then it doesn't matter where the sound is coming from, left or right, you'll always have at least one cochlear implant that is protected as long as there's only a single noise source. And so therefore, you're able to discern speech with 100% performance. So that's similar to a hearing person, which is an important result. And that's one of the biggest benefits of 2 cochlear implants. There's another aspect to this, which is that if you are somebody that has one cochlear implant and that cochlear implant doesn't work very well, then having a second one can lead to a dramatic improvement. Now, so the future of the devices, I've already discussed the first 2 of these. The third one is increasing the number of channels. So having greater cochlear coverage to provide fine spectral information. And this would lead to improved speech, performance, and improved music appreciation. But that's not there today. We don't have cochlear implants today with sufficient number of channels to actually achieve that. Another area of research is on reducing power, because if you could reduce the amount of power the cochlear implant required, then you could put the entire device inside a person's head, which would have many advantages. And then finally, cochlear implant performance is limited by the number of surviving auditory nerve neurons. And so the regeneration of neurons is an important area of research. And so to summarize, implants have enabled the post-implant deaf to hear, and they've provided sufficient information to support language development in children, which is a truly remarkable result. Implants have become a probe of speech recognition, and we've learned that exploiting tonotopic organization is a key to the implant's success. The number of channels, the frequency of assignment of the electrodes are key to perception of speech and the comprehension of that speech. The cochlear implant learning curve also demonstrates nicely that the adult brain is plastic. And at the time those tests were done, it wasn't so clear that that was the case. For things like music and speech quality, and also the recognition of male and female voices and accents, this requires the fine spectral information which the current generations of cochlear implants don't provide. And finally, as implants, as the first prosthesis to successfully restore a neural function, have become a benchmark in biomedical engineering. And so I have a few final thoughts. The first is that a cochlear implant is a wonderful example of the power of interdisciplinary science and technology. All the different disciplines I've listed here and biology are working together in a tiny package inside a human being to improve the human condition. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that we do science. Today, this actually is end of 2017, which was the last time I was able to find the data. It doesn't get updated every year. There are about 500,000 people now with a cochlear implant in the world. With the latest devices, 3/4 of post-lingually deaf adults can use a telephone, and small children can hear their parents' voices and learn to understand them. sometimes a year or so after I've given this talk, I receive an email from a person I've never met who tells me that they have recently received a cochlear implant and they're really happy with it. And one of the reasons that they have the implant and why they're writing to me now is because they've learned about the device from a friend who was in the audience at this talk. So all of you, please spread the word. So it's critically important that we work to make this technology more widely known and available to everyone that could benefit from it. Today, there are around 25 million citizens alive that have been born profoundly deaf. 1.4, 10 to the 5 children born each year with profound hearing loss. The world cochlear implant sales are 50,000 a year in 2013, and it's not possible to get accurate data for today. But you can actually see that there's a big mismatch between the production of cochlear implants and the number of people that would need one. And we really do have to work very hard to try to change that situation. The vast majority of the people that are deaf are in underdeveloped countries. The vast majority of people with a cochlear implant are in developed countries. At a personal level, 16 years ago, I had my hearing restored, and it's enabled me to more easily conduct research and to teach, and to hear my wife's voice for the first time in 12 years, and to hear my daughter's voice for the very first time. And so I'm going to dedicate this talk to Richard Miyamoto, who is my surgeon. He just recently retired. The various people listed here helped me put this talk together. Some of them are world experts in cochlear implants and in biomedical engineering or in the cellular basis for hearing, and others are students and former friends. And so I close with this poem. It was written by a young deaf child. I have a dream. The sky is blue, I see it. The grass is green, I see it. I see the beautiful flowers, blue ocean and bright sunshine. But why this world feels so lonely and so silent? Why are Mama's eyes so full of tears? Teardrops are running down her face. Mama told me my ears are sick. Mama told me I needed to learn to speak. I need to learn to speak diligently. I slowly learned to speak under Mama's careful guidance from one sound, one word, one phrase, and one sentence. They string my dreams together. I have a dream. I want to hear the sound of an ocean wave. I have a dream. I want to hear birds chirping. I have a dream. I want to hear my mama call my name. I have a dream. I want to use my own voice to say, I love you, Mama. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really, really great. So I'd ask everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat for this talk, because it will be easier to answer them. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? I can start with a question.
Well, while I'm waiting for questions, by the way, I should say that normally when I give a talk by Zoom, I connect my implant directly to the Mac, and then I hear everything crystal clear. But when we did the test tonight for this presentation, because some of the movie files and sound files don't seem to be compatible with running my Mac in that mode, we've had to do it with me just simply wearing my implant in the normal fashion without a wire going into the computer, and that makes it actually harder. So I'm telling you this because I wouldn't want you to think that I can't actually understand people on Zoom. I can, it's just not in this mode, in a very echoey room when I'm not attached to the Mac. So any questions? Why is the number of electrodes low? So that's a very good question. So the reason that the number of electrodes is low is because it's not very easy to put a very large number of electrodes into a cochlea. A cochlea is a very small thing. It's the size of a pea. We're trying to thread wires into a scale that is only about 1 millimeter across. And you have to not just thread them in, you have to get them or if you want to get them all the way to the apex, and ideally you want to get them to the apex and then work your way down, you have to thread them into the helix, and the helix is 2.5 turns. And so it's extremely difficult to get the wires in. And so therefore, the type of devices that we're using today, where we have individual electrodes, are not possible to scale up very much. There have been some work done, there have been some tests of cochlear implants with more than 10 electrodes or 20 electrodes, which is fairly standard, up to 100 or more. But as soon as you start to put in a lot of wires, not only does it get hard to do that, but as the second problem comes up, which is that when the electrode is pulsed, a biphasic pulse is causing an electric field to appear at that electrode, which is at some point in your cochlea. But now that electric field propagates, and it's that presence of this electric field that causes the auditory nerve to get stimulated and then evoke potentials passing on the auditory nerve to the brain. Yeah, it's very difficult to control where the electric field propagates to, and in fact the electric field spreads out quite a lot. And so the way to minimize the interference between the different electric fields that would occur if you had even adjacent electrodes, and even if you only had 10, what we do is we pulse one electrode, say electrode number 3, and then the next electrode we pulse is a long way from electrode 3, maybe electrode 8. And then we pulse an electrode, say number 1, and this is called interleaved sampling, and it's done to avoid the interactions of electric fields between the different electrodes that are stimulating the auditory nerve, because otherwise you're inadvertently stimulating at places that don't correspond to the frequencies that were generated and recorded by the cochlear implant. And so it's interference that's an ultimate limitation of this device. The electrodes are not literally attached to the auditory nerve. And so the propagation of the electric fields causes confusion. You have interference to take into account. Superposition of waves, in other words. So does that answer your question? Yes, good. I can tell you something else though, which you might find interesting about this, which is that if you do want to try, if you imagine 2 electrodes, and imagine they're separated by about a couple of millimeters, which is the reality in me and in other cochlear implantees. What you can do is have virtual channels. And so virtual channels work in the following way. And instead of stimulating channel 1 or channel 2, you can stimulate channel 1 and channel 2 together simultaneously. And if you do it just right, you can arrange that the constructive interference of the electric fields peaks at a place which is intermediate between the 2 channels. And in this way, it becomes possible to stimulate a part of the auditory nerve for which you don't have an individual channel at all. So this is called virtual channels. And as you can imagine, if you take the 2 electrodes that are adjacent, vary the ratio of the electric fields on each, you can then choose to stimulate any point along the cochlea. And so work of that type is ongoing. And so that would be another way to get around the limitation of the channels. So then there's a question is, will your hearing be affected as I get older, like it does for a hearing person, or will it stay at the same level? This is a great question. And of course, I'm very pleased to have to tell you that my hearing is bionic, which means that it will last forever. Now, I should give you some caveats on that. So caveat number 1 is that if I hit my head in the wrong place, I'll break my implant, and then I'll have to get a new one. And it's not very pleasant. The surgery is a major surgery. That surgery I showed you very quickly is, depending on the person, it can be 4 to 6 hours under general anesthesia. And it involves a great deal of swelling and a lot of downtime. Not so much downtime from work, but when your head is swollen and you've got a bandage on your head, you don't feel like going back to class and teaching. And when I was teaching, of course I was teaching at that point, in America, it's very common for, because the medical school system is different to the UK, the students take a pre-med degree for 4 years before they go to medical school, rather than going directly to medical school, as is the case in the UK. And during that pre-med, they have to take quite a lot of physics. And what determines whether they get into a good medical school is often whether they got an A in physics. So when I was having my surgery, I was teaching pre-meds at the time. And so they were extremely interested in how the surgery was going and what would happen to me. But then after I got out of the surgery, because I looked a little bit disfigured, I didn't actually give a lecture for a couple of weeks. And so we just communicated by email. And then after that, I went back into class and gave the lectures. So it might had a downtime, but then it came up and then you've got your hearing and it lasts forever in principle. Now, you could ask another question about this, which is what happens if you're a young child and you get a cochlear implant because your head is still growing. And so one of the things you can do is put in electrodes between the ASIC inside your skull and the cochlea that are longer than you need, so that as you grow and your head gets bigger, they take up the slack. But there is a limit to how well that can work. And it might be that in some cases, some modifications would be needed as you get older. So that's two aspects of it. There's another aspect about it being bionic that I could mention, which is that because it is purely electronic, I can program this to have different frequency sensitivity to a natural ear. For example, I could, if I wish, listen to bats at very high frequencies or dogs. And there's not much happening at those high frequencies. It's not very interesting, so I don't do that, but I could. I could also, in principle, under certain circumstances, hear softer sounds than a hearing person. But it would have to be under very special circumstances, and it's not very useful to do it because the correlate of loudness with the cochlear implant is the amount of electrical current. And so if you turn up the current in my device, sounds get louder and louder, but the point is, if you turn up the current too much, it hurts. So you can't do that. And so the way the device is set up, it's set up to produce a maximum amount of current, which corresponds to a sound that is probably around 70 decibels or so. And so as a person gets louder, if they start shouting, I wouldn't notice that they were shouting. It would sound like they were just speaking loudly, not really shouting, because as the sound got louder than 70 decibels, no more current would be produced by my implant, so I wouldn't hear it. But yes, it will last forever. So I think what will happen 20, 30 years from now, as people get older and their natural hearing fades away, instead of having hearing aids, more and more people will have cochlear implants because they're very powerful, very versatile, and they'll become much more affordable. Like everything else, there'll be possible eventually to make something that's bionic. And the cochlear implant was simply the first of these. The reason that 33, that's the next question. I hope I answered your question okay, by the way, Ewan. While you're answering, I'm going to move on to the next question. Why is 33 easier to understand than yes? The reason is that yes is monosyllabic. Now 33 is 2 words. So because of bottom-up processing, is entirely dependent on how much of it there is. So 33 has 2 bits of information. Actually, it actually has more because 30 is 2 sounds already, and then 3. So I've got 3 syllables I can pick up. Whereas with yes, it's just one single sound. It's not very distinct, even though it has a yes sound in it. It all merges into one. And so trying to understand the context of the yes is important, and that's top-down processing. And so a single word is very, very hard to identify, almost always, unless it's a word with many syllables. Like, I don't know, onomatopoeia would probably be something I'd recognize, but yes is really hard. 33, since I told you to say a number like 33, it was then pretty easy to figure that out. But yes, no sound quite similar. So I hope that answered your question, Max. And then the next question is from Lorenzo, and he says, do people with cochlear implants need to get other surgeries in life to change the battery in part which is implanted in their ear? No. So the answer, that's another great question, and the answer is no. And the reason is because there's no battery inside. The only batteries are outside. The batteries are actually here. If I take this off, the batteries are in that. And the battery, if you want to know what sort of batteries are they, they're actually like this. If you can see that, these are the batteries that you use for a cochlear implant. So these ones are actually designed for a cochlear implant, but in fact, this type of battery would also work for a hearing aid. The difference is that if you have a state-of-the-art digital hearing aid today, one of the best you can buy, one of these batteries, or a battery very similar to it, will power that digital hearing aid for 3 weeks. I use 2 of these batteries every 8 to 12 hours. And the reason is because, of course, we're not amplifying sound with my cochlear implant. We're actually running a spectral analysis of the sound. We're then producing a radio wave, modulating that radio wave by digitizing the spectral analysis, sending it to the transmitter there. The transmitter's got to put that through the skin. You've then got to pick that radio wave up. You can use the radio wave to power the pulse generator that's inside my head that will be instructed to send currents to different electrodes dependent on decoding the radio wave through another spectral analysis. So that takes a lot of power, a really large amount of power. And so I use somewhere between 1,200 and 1,800 joules a day. Now, there's another aspect to this, if you think about it. Supposing you did have a battery and you could put it in your head, and supposing that battery could store 1,200 joules. If anything went wrong and that battery suddenly discharged, you'd be in great danger of losing your life. And so there's all kinds of reasons why currently the cochlear implant is entirely outside. However, the battery is entirely outside. However, in the future, we will move to having cochlear implants inside, but before we can do that, we have to have much more efficient cochlear implants so that they don't require so much power to run them, so that the amount of stored energy is much less. And in this case, they'll be safe. So I hope that answers your question, Lorenzo. And then there's from Oxford Physics to everyone. So hello, Oxford. So this one says, does the recognition of sounds with the cochlear implant change depending on how long a person has been deaf? So first of all, yes, absolutely. I'll answer that more in a second. Since you said that a lot of the sound recognition comes from top-down processing, so relies on memories of sounds, is this harder to regain depending on how long it has been since you're hearing these sounds naturally? So the vast majority of the reason why when somebody's post-lingually deaf for 12 years and then gets a cochlear implant and then doesn't hear is not because they don't remember the sounds. It's actually because their auditory nerve is atrophied. Because when the auditory nerve is not constantly stimulated by the electricity being generated by the hair cells, it's not being fed, it's no longer doing anything, and so it gives up and it dies back. Not in everybody, but in some people. And I was very fortunate that my auditory nerve was in good condition and had remained in good condition. So that's the main reason. Once the auditory nerve dies back, the distance between the electrodes that are producing the electric fields and the neurons of the auditory nerve, as it gets larger and larger and larger, the electric fields are diminishing simply by 1 over r squared. And so what happens is that the auditory nerve no longer sees and senses the electric fields. And so it's not going to produce any evoked potentials if it's functioning at all. And so that's the main reason why, as the period of time since the onset of deafness occurs, the performance of the cochlear implant can go down. The interesting thing about the top-down processing of sound is that our understanding of language, if we've learned language as a hearing person, is very deep and profound. It's an intimate part of us. And the same with music as well. And for these reasons, it's very much like learning to ride a bicycle. Once you've learned to ride a bicycle, once you've mastered that balance, and I hope you can all remember the first few times you got on a bicycle and hit the ground, and you had to learn how to ride that bike. I remember my father pushed me fast. His idea was that you had to learn to ride by falling down. And so he pushed me super fast and I'd fall off the bike. He'd pick me up, put me on the bike, push me again, and the same thing would happen. But after 3 goes, I knew how to balance. And once you learn how to balance, you can always balance. So in that sense, we're able to use the top-down processing really well. And when I use words like top-down processing memory and memory of music and memory of sound, musical memory, I don't mean by memory that fades. I mean more accessing the parts of our brains that interpreted those sounds when we could hear. So I hope that answers the question. It's another, I mean, by the way, I should say all these questions are absolutely terrific, really terrific. Thank you so much for the questions. Oh, there's another one. This one from Amelia. So you mentioned that you could adjust the frequencies you were hearing. If, for instance, a musician had a cochlear implant, could they tune their cochlear implant specifically to hear music, specifically to the musical scale, and to hear it more accurately than you do? Or do you already hear music as close to normal as is possible? So this question, to start, because cochlear implants today typically only have 10 to 20 or so channels, the ability to recognize individual notes on a piano is quite limited. And if you did tune the implant, you could certainly tune it so that one channel corresponded to middle C and the next channel corresponded to C sharp, but you'd only have 10 to 20 channels to play with. So the best you could do is probably 20 notes of the piano, and the piano has 88 keys. And I'm not sure if that experiment has even been done. But what I can tell you that I find quite remarkable about memory of sound is that if I sit at the piano right now, and I wasn't born with perfect pitch, but I was born with good relative pitch. So when I was a child, I could play the piano. If I heard a song, I could play the song. I didn't need to read manuscript. And so now today, if I sit down at the piano and someone else sits next to me, so now I shut my eyes and somebody strikes me to C and asks me, what note did you strike? I will not know. All I know is I hear a note. I know that it's not super high or super low, but I don't know where it is. It's just somewhere in the middle of the piano. And if that person, I've still got my eyes shut, this person strikes C sharp, the C sharp above middle C, and asks me which is higher, I wouldn't know. I couldn't tell. However, if I now open my eyes and I strike middle C, it sounds like middle C. And if I strike C sharp, it sounds like C sharp. So, and this is the brain is not allowing things to sound wrong, and it just uses musical memory and it just takes over and makes things sound correct, which is a really interesting process. So therefore you can see that it would be very difficult to answer the other parts of your question, to specifically tune the cochlear implant to the musical scale, because you wouldn't have enough electrodes to cover all of it. You can only do a small piece of it. And in fact, most people professional musicians in general, I don't actually know very many that have a cochlear implant, but they would rely more on reading manuscript today to be accurate and using their cochlear implant for the temporal cues than they would to be able to rely on how it sounds to them. They'd rely very much on the manuscript. It may well sound very nice to them, but to be accurate, you would have to read the manuscript. When I was, shortly after I was implanted, about a year afterwards, I went down, every 6 months you had to go to the hospital to be checked to make sure the device was working well. There were no misconnections, to adjust currents, all kinds of different things to try to optimize the performance. Now I was lucky, my device worked really well from the beginning, but there were still tweaks over the next couple of years. And I remember the first year, I arrived and the audiologists became like friends. They became like your brothers or sisters. You love to see them and they love to see you because you were doing so well with the device. And they told me that there was and I asked them about music and playing music again. And they told me that one of their patients was a well-known violinist and worked with the local symphony orchestra, but that she'd lost her hearing and got a cochlear implant. And with the cochlear implant, she was very excited because she could play music and it sounded great to her. So she came to the surgery, and she had been there a few hours before me that day, and she had played for the audiologist the music. But unfortunately, she was not reading a manuscript, she was just playing. And the audiologist didn't know how to tell her that it sounded dreadful, but it did, because she was off. She wasn't on key at all. And she didn't know, and she's a professional musician now, if she was reading the music, of course, she'd be precise. But she didn't get it right. She was relying on memory. She had played by, she had probably had perfect pitch. She was trying to do that, and she wasn't generating an accurate enough copy of the sound she was trying to play. And so the music didn't sound so great. So I hope that gives you a sense of answering that question. I mean, so the next question is from Amanda, and it's a follow-up from earlier questions that were asked. The virtual channels sound really promising, yeah, and that they are, and that seems to imply that you could improve the encoding without modifying the physics implant. Yes, yes. So it turns out that some of the question ends by saying, do you get software updates? Yes, I do. And not just software updates either. So what I'm wearing tonight is the third cochlear implant I've had. The original implant inside is the same as it always has been, but the outside part, so that means most importantly, the application-specific integrated circuit, that has changed twice. And with the more powerful ASIC, it can do better spectral analysis than the previous ones could. And so it's backwards compatible with the earlier version of the implant. So there's no need to change the electrodes inside. That's an option too, but it's not necessary for the device I'm wearing now. And this new one is also completely wireless. I'm not running it in wireless mode, but I could run it in a wireless mode, which would obviate the need to have a wire running around the back of my neck between the transmitter and up here, the ASIC doing the analysis. And you might have, and the software can be updated and then downloaded. I mean, basically the ASIC is a computer without an operating system. So indeed, every time I go to the Radcliffe once a year. That's the hospital in Oxford to be checked. But until 6 years ago, I lived in America, and so I went to hospitals there. And when I first came to Oxford and went to the Radcliffe, I didn't know what to expect because the hospital was very different. The hospital I went to in America was a specialist children's hospital. And I knew the Radcliffe was a big, more general hospital, but actually when I was told where to go, it was to the children's hospital. It was the children's part, the children's wing, and that's where audiology is. And there were adults and children there, and far more adults than children, whereas in an American equivalent hospital, there'd be far more children than adults, in my experience. I was usually the oldest person in the room. And in this hospital, it wasn't quite like that. But what was fascinating was how the experience of being tested was really different. In the US, you drive 60 miles. Some people drive hundreds of miles to go to their test. You get tested, it takes 30 to 40 minutes. It's all very professional. You get some graphs. They may do a bit of tweaking to your implant. And then you pay $1,200 or so. And then you drive home. And so in the Radcliffe, there wasn't one audiologist. They actually had arranged for a specialist to come all the way from Durham, who was an expert on my type of implant, which is called a Medel. They're made in Austria. And most people at the Radcliffe during that period were not using Medel, so they didn't have almost any patient with it. And so a specialist came all the way from Durham. And then there was an Oxford audiologist as well. These two people spent almost 2 hours with me measuring and testing instead of the 30 minutes in the US. And they were able to download all the data from the US, like the audiograms and other things, and then overlay the new data they'd taken with the data from America. And the agreement was astonishingly good, which now for a physicist, it was just so gratifying to see that. So at the end of this whole procedure, I go out to reception to make my next appointment. And I already got my wallet out and my credit card. And the person said, well, why do you have the credit card out? I said, because I'm going to pay you now. And they said, well, you don't pay, it's free. And I'd just completely forgotten what an amazing thing the socialized medical system is. So anyway, so I go once a year to be tested on that. And I think that the virtual channels as a way forward, I will be eventually, they will eventually figure out a way to make sure that you don't have too much channel interaction and that the virtual channel model will work well. But at the moment, it's not yet available, as far as I know, in a commercial device, so there are lots of tests going on. And yes, I do get software updates quite regularly. And but it's not like when you have a Mac and you get something that tells you that, you know, most of us, even though we use Macs, we've got some Microsoft software. And so they're always updating their software, so you get a little ping to update. And with a cochlear implant, it doesn't work that way. I don't get a ping of that type. Actually, it's the Medel, the company, or else the hospital that sends you a message to say, hey, there's a new device out. Are you interested in trying it? And so I always say yes, and that gives me a new device, and it's a new toy, and it works even better than the previous one. So I hope that answers the question, Amanda. Thank you. Yeah, I guess that did answer the question. Yes, I'm looking forward to my next upgrade. This one is 2 years old now, so I think about another year or so, and there'll be another upgrade. Eventually, they're probably going to be necessary to have surgery again to have a better set of electrodes, because eventually there will be many more electrodes will be possible, or other technologies will be used that enable many more electrodes to be inserted in some way. And I think that we're going to be seeing that kind of thing relatively soon. For example, I told you that the auditory nerve can atrophy, and when it atrophies, it's so far from where it should be that the electric fields are not efficient at stimulating it. So with neurotrophic growth factors, you can get auditory nerves to regrow. And so if you want the auditory nerve to regrow into exactly the right place, you can actually insert the scaffold with neurotrophic growth factor on it into the place that you want the auditory nerve to grow, which will be back towards the cochlea. And then if that scaffold itself was the electrodes, it might be possible to actually stimulate individual bundles of auditory nerve fibers and give a closer perception to the frequencies that you enjoy as a hearing person. So, can hair cells be regenerated is another question. That's right. So there's a lot of work on hair cell regeneration. Some of that work a few years ago, there was a belief that maybe mammals couldn't regenerate hair cells, but it was known that that wasn't true for some other types of life on Earth. But for mammals, it didn't seem that it was possible. But I believe for certain other classes, it was, I think birds, for example. So what's been done in recent times have been various experiments on how to get hair cells to regrow. And so you need to be able to express certain genes and turn off other genes such that the hair cells start growing again. Because in our infancy, before we're ever born, when we're in the womb, the hair cells are growing. And there are various helper cells that make sure that hair cells go to the right place, grow in the right place, and so on. And at a certain point, that development pathway is switched off. And then that's our hair cells. And I think that for evolutionary reasons, there was no real reason to regrow hair cells. The human ear is a remarkable hearing device. It's incredibly sensitive, so sensitive that you can actually, in principle, hear pressure waves that correspond to very tiny displacements in atoms of order and atom width. Because of this incredible sensitivity, which was important in the early life of man, humankind had to survive in a very hostile world, and hearing was very important to figure out where enemies were coming from and escape dinosaurs and all kinds of stuff in our predecessors. But in the modern world, and people didn't live that long either in those days. So hearing was supposed to last for maybe, 30 years, something like that. The challenges have come from living longer combined with a very noisy environment. And this has done enormous damage to our hair cells. And so work has been ongoing for some time to figure out how we can turn back on the development. And so it's been learned that you can, and in fact, this has been done in mice, where you can get the hair cells, so you make the mouse deaf by destroying their hair cells. And you can do that chemically. Then, or you can there's another way you can do it, is to breed deaf mice, where they don't have hair cells at all, because you've manipulated the genes in such a way that the hair cells never grow in the first place. So anyway, you start off with a mouse that doesn't have any hair cells, and then you arrange by expression of the genes to get the hair cells to start growing. And they grow and they grow. And if you now look at what you get a rather disordered array of hair cells growing all around growing off of the basilar membrane and in other places too. And so if you then stimulate the mouse and see if it can hear, then it clearly can hear something, but whether the sounds are very nice or not is less clear, because you can't actually ask the mouse, how does that sound to you? But yes, I mean, you can regenerate hair cells now, but we haven't yet learned how to do it in a way that would be efficacious as a treatment. Now, when I got my cochlear implant, I was very keen to know whether such things could happen, because I could avoid surgery if we could find some way to get hair cells to regrow. But in those days, it was believed it wasn't possible. Today, there's a lot of progress, and I haven't read the latest papers, but so far, hair cell regeneration has not been an effective strategy for restoring hearing, but I think it will be one day. And I also think that those scaffolding ideas I told you about, combined with neurotrophic growth factors, will also be an important thing, because even if you get the hair cells to regrow, that's not enough if the auditory nerve is atrophied. So I hope that gives you a sense of where we are with that topic. Then there's a question from Sam. It says, if you hear a version of music that had previously known that was different, e.g. a live version or in a different key to the original, would that still sound like music to you, or would it be like our perception of the 8-channel sound? No, for me, in fact, tonight, when we were doing the sound checks with Tasmin at 5:30, at one point we weren't sure why some sounds weren't being generated. So Tasmin generated some sounds by playing something on YouTube, I think. And I could hear that. So then I tried to see if I could generate some sounds that Tasmin could hear. And so I chose, I went to YouTube and I just clicked on Pink Floyd, and we got some, I forget what it was, but it was something like Comfortably Numb or some well-known song. But it was a live version of the song rather than the studio version from whatever year that was made. And because things like Pink Floyd were going when I was a child, Pink Floyd were already a big band, my knowledge of Pink Floyd is pretty good. So I know that song. And so even though it was a live version, I could tell it was a live version. It sounded slightly different to the studio version, but it sounded fabulous. But we only lasted for 10 seconds, because once Tasmin said she could hear it, I stopped playing it. And I don't actually listen to music that much, because I seem to be so busy all day and all evening that there's not time to listen to music. Whenever I want to really relax, I really like to listen to music, but then I have to plug in my implant to my Mac, and then I can't share the music with someone else because they can't hear it at the same time unless I set up separate speakers. But yes, I mean, it's a great question. And the answer is, I can tell the difference, but it all sounds really good. And that's really, and it's easy to understand why that is, because the musical memory that's making it sound good is a flexible thing, because it's our brains. Our brains are very flexible. And so our brain is not put off slightly by a missing word, and it's not put off slightly by an accent that you haven't heard before. You can still understand the language being spoken if you know that language already. And it's the same with music. If I suddenly was singing to you now, and of course I won't do that, but if I suddenly started singing and I hear off key, which is quite likely given that I hear myself in a different way to the way you will hear me, I wouldn't be put off by that. I just keep singing. I wouldn't even maybe know it was off key, but if I did, I wouldn't be distracted by it. As long as life is sounding good to you, you might not be distracted by it either. The trouble is, the reality would be that when I sing, it would all be off key, and so you wouldn't enjoy it very much. But I hope that answers the question. Thank you for that, Sam. Thanks Home also for that question.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for asking your questions, and thank you so much to Ian for the amazing talk. If you want to unmute and like applaud, because it's difficult on Zoom, but like that was really, really amazing. Thank you so much for talking to us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was just great to meet you all. I hope to get a chance to meet you all again soon and give you another talk in the